In this video, I will discuss the methodological changes that has been introduced when GDP at a new base was released around 2015. If we go back to the time when the GDP numbers at the new base were released, there was a huge uproar in the media as to whether the new government which has come has cooked up GDP numbers, and also there were doubts were raised and apprehensions were expressed by the then RBI governor and also international agencies, and the media thought that perhaps India has gone the Chinese way, where the official statistics are taken with a pinch of salt. Till that time, the credibility of Central Statistical Organization was very high, but when the GDP at the 2011-12 base was released, there was a lot of skepticism about the correctness of the numbers, because the 2013-14 growth, which was in the new base, turned out to be around 7%, as opposed to only 5% in the old base of 2004-5. Now, this leads us to ask the question: why such a change in the GDP growth numbers, and to what extent the apprehensions raised about the reliability of the GDP measures are correct. And I will try to put the debate in perspective by looking into the methodological changes which was introduced in the 2011-12 base. In fact, it is a common phenomena that the GDP numbers are linked to a particular base year, and the base year undergoes a revision in every 5 to 10 years. In India, the before the 2011-12 base, the base that was used was 2004-5, and before that it was 99-2000. Then before that it was 93-94. Then it was way back in time in 81, and before 80-81, and after independence, the practice was to change the base every decade. So 60-61, 70-71, 80-81 were the base years at which GDP was computed. Now, the question is, what is this base, and what is the significance of the base year? Now, to answer that question, we have to appreciate that GDP is measuring the total value of goods and services produced in an economy during a given period of time. Now, if we were to measure GDP, we have to ensure that when we are computing the growth using the GDP numbers, we are able to reflect the correct picture with regard to availability of goods and services in the economy. Uh, as you recall, GDP was the market value of all final goods and services. Now, when we are saying market value, what essentially it means is that we are taking the prices of different goods and the quantities produced of different goods, and when we sum it over, suppose if I say GDP is nothing but summation of PIQI, where I ranges from 1 to n, I will not be incorrect. It would be a broad generalization and aggregation again. So GDP, if it is summation PIQI, where I ranging from 1 to n, what this expression gives me: P1Q1 P plus P2Q2 plus P3Q3 up to P and Qn is the GDP, and where we are assuming that suppose there are n goods which are produced in an economy. Now it is the summation of the price multiplied by quantity which gives me the market value of different goods. And when I sum up the market value of all goods and services that is produced in the economy, I get the GDP. Now the catch is, if GDP is summation PIQI, where I is ranging from 1 to n, now this increase in GDP uh, can come about either from an increase in P or from an increase in Q. Now, if an increase in GDP is coming from an increase in Q, or which is the quantity of goods and services which is available, then and prices are remaining stable. Suppose today the price is say P1, and previous year it was P0, and this year the quantity is Q1, and the quantities in the previous year was Q0. Then the market value was P0 Q0 in the last year, and this year it is P1 Q1. And we are trying to see, when we are measuring growth, how the P1 how much P1 Q1 is more than P0 Q0 in percentage terms. Now, as we are measuring a product, which is P and Q, if there is not much difference between P1 and P0, but the difference is coming from the change in Q. Suppose Q1 it has gone up by say 20%, whereas P is has increased by say only 1%, and I am getting a very high growth in GDP. Then it is certainly a very desirable scenario, because GDP growth is high, and this high growth is also connoting that more goods and services are available for the people to consume, and ultimately GDP is reflecting the standard of living. Now, if a higher GDP should also connote a better standard of living, and a better standard of living means more goods and services should be made available, and if that is coming out, then we say that things are really improving. But assuming it is the other way, that there has been a monsoon failure which has led to a drop in production of agricultural commodities, which is also impacting the supply of raw material to industry, which ultimately is leading to a price pressure in the economy, where prices are rising by say 20%. And because of the lack of monsoon, agricultural production has not come up in a big way, and because raw material supply to industry has not been adequate, industrial production has suffered. So the net impact has been that output in fact has fallen by 5%, but prices have in fact risen by 20%, and the net impact again is the same, that GDP jumps by a sizable number. Now, in this kind of a scenario, what we are getting is GDP growth is high, but at the same time, we are finding that this high growth is not getting translated in terms of more goods and services being made available. Rather, it is connoting that less goods and services are available because of some disturbance, as we discussed. In this case, there was a failure of monsoon, which ultimately was reflecting the higher prices or an inflationary situation. So when we are getting an increase in GDP from higher prices rather than greater availability of goods and services, then GDP is really not reflecting what it is supposed to reflect. That means an increase in GDP should be reflecting greater availability of goods and services. But when this doesn't happen, then GDP no more serves as an indicator of standard of living. Now, to avoid drawing wrong inferences from an increase in GDP growth, in other words, if we are saying an increase in GDP is not, rather to put it in another way, to avoid drawing wrong inferences from the growth numbers, when GDP is growing but availability of goods and services are not increasing, to prevent such kind of a scenario, we use the concept of base year. What we do, we try to fix the prices as on a particular year. And suppose if I say my prices remains the same P0, and this year I will be tracking only the new quantities, but I will be using the old prices. So what I will get is P0Q1. I am using the old prices and the new quantities, and then I am comparing it with P0Q0. So if the new GDP or the GDP this year, which is P0Q1, when I am using the last year prices, and I am comparing this with P0Q0, and I am finding an increase in GDP, then I am quite sure that this increase in GDP has come about from higher availability of goods and services, and it is not being influenced unduly by the rising prices. So the base year is nothing but that year for whose prices we are using to compute the GDP in the subsequent years. As I said, if I am using last year's prices to compute the GDP of this year, then last year serves as the base year. Now, base year helps us to reflect the change in GDP coming out or coming about from increased availability of goods and services. It assumes as if there has been no price change, or in other words, there is no inflation. And when I am trying to use the base year price and the current year quantities, and I am getting the GDP number, that GDP number is called the real GDP number. But if I use today's prices and today's quantity, that means this year's price and this year quantity, I will get what is known as the nominal GDP numbers. So nominal GDP number is capturing both increase in price as well as increase in quantity, whereas real GDP is capturing primarily the increase in availability of goods and services, increase in quantities, keeping prices constant. In that sense, it is said that the real GDP is corrected for inflation. That means we are measuring GDP assuming that there is no inflation. Now, there is always a trade-off. When I am using a base year, I am using the prices of the base year, then the natural corollary is that I will be tracking only those goods which were available in the base year. But the economy being dynamic in nature, every day new goods and services come to the market. There is R&D activities are taking place, technological major breakthroughs do come about. Now with the technological breakthrough and in the normal evolution of things, when new goods come into the market, because I am using the prices of base year, then as a consequence, I am not able to capture in my GDP the new goods which have come into the market this year or after the base year, because for those goods in the base year, those goods were non-existent, so there would be no prices available for them. So I cannot include in my computation of GDP all the new goods and services that reach the market after the base year. So the trade-off is that I am able to get a GDP number when I am using base year, which is corrected for inflation. But this GDP also to some extent is also an underestimation, because I am not capturing all the new goods and services which hit the market after we have chosen the base year. Now before 2011-12, the base year that was used in India was 2004-5. That means if if one were to compute the real GDP in 2006, then one was using the prices of goods and services as they prevailed in 2005, but the quantity of those goods as they were available in 2006. Now, if in 2006 some new goods have been invented, Now, those goods cannot be captured when I am computing the GDP in 2006 because prices for them were not available in 2005. Now, the generally the practice is, as I have already shared with you, base year is changed periodically to reflect the introduction of new goods and services in the economy, and which should be captured while measuring the GDP. IMF suggests that the base year should be changed every 5 years. India had been earlier changing the base year every decade, but in the 2005 base, the base was changed after 5 years from 2000, and then the next base revision was due in 2010. But 2010 being not a normal year, 2011-12 was taken as the base year. When we are changing the base year, it is natural that the GDP does get a push because you are capturing now new goods and services. But eyebrows gets raised when the GDP gets a major jump upwards. Then people start raising questions as to how come there was so much of underestimation of the GDP, and now how come the GDP has overnight has increased. When the 2011-12 base GDP numbers were released, how did the growth numbers came about? We will see it in this chart. If you see, here, say 2013-14, here I have given the macroeconomic aggregates at current prices. Let us go to the macroeconomic aggregates at constant prices, which is the real GDP, because we are using the prices of the base year. When the base year was 2005, the growth in the GDP growth was 5%. The numbers in the parenthesis indicate the growth numbers, the year-on-year growth numbers. Now GDP grew at 5% in 2013-14 when the 2004-5 base year prices were used. When the base was shifted from 2005 to 2012, we found that the GDP growth suddenly shot up from 5% to 6.9%, and that's almost a 2 percentage point increase. Now, some critics said that maybe it was a ploy of the new government, because these numbers were released, the 2011-12 series was released somewhere around May 2015, and the new government had come into power in May 2014. So it was thought that perhaps government is trying to put a rosy picture of the economy, and that is why they are coming out with such high numbers of GDP. But let me tell you certain facts as to how these numbers are generated. When a base year change is done, it is not a month-long affair or a couple of months affair. It takes almost a year to, or maybe more than that, to decide on the base year what would be the base year, and the works are the computations do take place much before the numbers are released. So it is not that the 2011-12 base was decided by the new government. It was something which was started as a routine practice by the CSO, and it so happens that the numbers were released when a new government was in power. But also from a different perspective, it doesn't help also the new government to paint such a bright picture of the economy, that the economy in 2013-14 was growing at 7%, because if you recall, the government by Mr. Modi came to power by criticizing the UPA 2 government on the ground that the economy was languishing. Now, it doesn't help them to counter their own argument on which they came to power, that instead of the economy not doing well, the economy was in fact doing quite well. And if we see the subsequent spate of activities, the demonetization or the GST, all of them had their negative effect on GDP. And barring the 8.2% growth number in Q1 of 2018-19, the GDP growth numbers have in fact been very much on the lower side. So it is not the government's case that they will try to paint a very bright picture in 2015 about 2013-14 for the obvious reasons. Now the issue is how come why the GDP numbers shot up when the base was changed. For that, we have to appreciate some of the methodological changes which were introduced when the base was changed from 2005 to 11-12, because the 2011-12 base was not only an exercise of changing the base year but also a number of other methodological changes which were undertaken after a long delay. In fact, the GDP in each country is measured using some standard conventions, and the convention that is used is the conventions given by United Nations. Now United Nations had given its procedures or methodologies of computing GDP once in 1993, which is known as the SNA 1993, System of National Accounts 1993, and they revised it in 2008, which is known as the System of National Account 2008. Unfortunately, Indian statistical system has been lagging to adopt the best practices as far as the international practices are concerned while computing the GDP. India, when many countries had shifted to the System of National Account 2008, India was stuck up with the System of National Account 1993, and that continued till the base was shifted to 2011-12. So when the base year was changed from 2005 to 11-12, not only there was an increase in GDP because of the enlargement of the goods and services over the last 5-7 years from 5 to 12, but also because of changes in the practices used while computing the GDP. Let us look at some of the major methodological changes which were introduced in the 2011-12 base. First, a new concept was given which is known as the GVA at basic price, and from GVA at basic price, GVA at factor cost was derived, and even the GVA at factor cost and GVA at basic price, the GDP at market price can be derived. And in India, the headline GDP number was before the 2011-12 base, it was the GDP at factor cost, but the international practice was to use GDP at market price. So with 2011-12 release of the GDP numbers, the headline number of GDP also was changed to GDP at market price from GDP at factor cost. Now, one new concept which was introduced was the GVA at basic price. What it is given as the GVA at factor cost plus production tax minus production subsidy. And what is GVA at factor cost? GVA at factor cost is nothing but the old, as per the old terminology, it was the GDP at factor cost. Now GVA at factor cost, which was earlier referred to as GDP at factor cost, is nothing but from this equation it is GVA at basic price minus production taxes and plus production subsidies. Just rearranging this equation, the first equation, we get the second equation. Now the GDP at market price will be nothing but GVA at basic price plus product taxes minus product subsidies, because if you recall the net indirect tax that we discussed in the last session, it pertained to product taxes and product subsidies. Now the sales tax which was earlier imposed, it was on the product, but While computing the GDP at the 2011-12 base, the concept of production tax is introduced as in addition to the product tax, and production subsidy is also introduced in addition to product subsidies. So what is the difference between a production tax and a product tax, and what is the difference between a production subsidy and a product subsidy? See, the difference is this, that production taxes as opposed to product taxes are levied independent of the volume of production. Now, when somebody wants to manufacture a particular product, he has to build a plant, and that plant has to be on a piece of land. Now, how much of land revenue that is deposited with the government for the land on which the factory is built, or for that matter, whatever is the license fee which is given to the government, this doesn't depend on how much production takes place. It is a permission to take up production activity. Now, those levies are termed as production taxes, which are independent of the volume of production, whereas product taxes are levied on how much of goods are produced. So, uh, okay, so if you see, um, I will come to this, but before that, let us look at the distinction between production tax and product tax. Production taxes are paid or received with relation to the production and are independent of the volume of actual production. Let us look at some examples of it, like the land revenue, stamps and registration fee, tax on profession. All those are independent of how much production you are undertaking. And the production subsidies, like there are many government departments who undertake production activity, but their their cost of operation is often much higher than the revenue that they generate. One typical example could be the railways. Suppose government wants that railway connectivity should be given to some distant place or some rural areas. Now, uh, extending operation to a rural area may not yield in terms of revenue what it would in what it would require in terms of cost. So from a cost revenue point of view, if given if a independent business call is taken, perhaps the Indian Railways should not go to provide connectivity to a rural area. But from a welfare point of view, government feels that no, this needs to be done to improve connectivity, and the shortfall in or the excess of expenditure over revenue is made through a budgetary grant. Now, that grant is not taking care of the entire shortfall, but it is partially helping the Indian Railways to take care of its expenses. So the grant which is given to the railways or is in the form of a subsidy. It is independent of the volume of passengers that the railways take. So it is independent of the volume of production. So it is a production subsidy, which is not a one-to-one kind of subsidy, but it is a lump sum amount to partially provide relief to the organization which is undertaking some activities which is considered to be welfare augmenting in nature. Now, as far as product taxes are known, we know it is like sales tax. It, of course, in the earlier system when GST was not introduced, but import and export duties, and so those are levied on per unit of product.